Japanese people can't make whiskey. That was the consensus in 1920s Japan. One man ignored it, poured almost everything he had into proving it wrong, and hired the one Japanese person who actually knew how. 10 years later, that partnership ended, and the two men went on to build two separate companies that still define Japanese whiskey today. This is the story of how Suntory was built, and how the same partnership that built it also produced its biggest rival.
The man was Shinjiro Torii. He started as an apprentice at an Osaka drug wholesaler at age 13, learning how imported goods, chemistry, and Western products actually worked in a country that was still getting used to them. By 1899, he'd founded his own company, Kotobukiya, the business that would eventually become Suntory. His first big success wasn't whiskey, it was wine. Imported Spanish wine was too sour, too foreign for Japanese palates, and it sat on shelves unsold. So Torii spent years testing his own blends until he landed on something sweeter, something built for a Japanese customer instead of a European one. He called it Akadama port wine. It became a massive hit, and it gave Torii two things he'd need for what came next: the capital to fund a much riskier bet, and the confidence that he understood what Japanese taste actually wanted, even when experts told him otherwise.
Whiskey was a different problem entirely. Everyone around Torii said the same thing. Japan couldn't make real whiskey. The climate was wrong, the water was wrong, the palate was wrong, and, more practically, no one in the country actually knew how to distill and age it properly. Torii poured nearly all of his wine profits into the venture anyway, reportedly telling his skeptical staff a phrase that's still repeated in Japan today: "Yate minahai," roughly, just try it. The exact moment he said it isn't precisely documented, but the attitude behind it defined the next decade of his career. To solve the no one knows how problem, Torii hired the one person in Japan who did, Masataka Taketsuru, a chemist who had spent 2 years in Scotland studying whiskey production firsthand, and who came home not just with technical notes, but with a Scottish wife, Rita, who would spend the rest of her life in Japan. In 1923, construction began on what would become Japan's first dedicated whiskey distillery.
The first major disagreement between them was about location. Taketsuru wanted Hokkaido, in Japan's far north. Its cold climate and long winters were the closest match to Scotland's, and to him, climate was the whole point. Torii chose Yamazaki instead, a spot tucked between Osaka and Kyoto. According to Japanese language accounts of the decision, Torii's reasoning was practical rather than romantic. The site had a reputation for exceptionally good soft water. It sat on a rail line between two major cities, and it was a place investors, journalists, and future customers could actually visit without a multi-day trip to the northern edge of the country. Taketsuru's preferred site would have to wait more than a decade. It was the first clear sign that this partnership would run on Torii's commercial logic, not necessarily Taketsuru's craft logic. It would not be the last. In hindsight, the disagreement over Yamazaki reads less like a one-off argument and more like a preview. The same basic tension, feel and craft on one side, numbers and logistics on the other, that would keep resurfacing between them for the next decade.
By 1929, Torii was ready to sell. Taketsuru wasn't. He wanted the whiskey aged 5 to 10 years, the way it would have been in Scotland, before it ever reached a shelf. But Torii was watching years of interest payments pile up on a distillery that wasn't generating revenue, and he pushed for an earlier launch. They compromised at 4.5 years. The result, marketed as Shirofuda, or white label, hit Japanese shelves with a smoky, peaty intensity that Scottish whiskey drinkers might have recognized, but that didn't match what Japanese consumers, raised on Torii's own sweeter wine, actually wanted. Sales fell flat. It was a second data point in the exact same pattern as the location dispute. When craft and commerce disagreed, commerce won the argument, and the result underperformed. If there's a lesson in the Shirofuda failure, it's a specific one. Understanding how to distill whiskey, and understanding what a specific market wants to drink turned out to be two different skill sets, and Kotobukaya only fully had one of them.
By the early 1930s, Taketsuru had moved on from distilling to running Kotobukiya's beer operation at a factory in Tsurumi, near Yokohama. Then, in November 1933, Kotobukiya announced that it was selling that factory. Several independent Japanese-language accounts, including his own Wikipedia entry and multiple retrospective business articles, describe this as a genuinely difficult moment for Taketsuru, the person who was actually running the operation being sold out from under him. The primary source that would settle exactly what he knew and when, a memoir he published decades later, remains only partially accessible today, so this video can't confirm with certainty how much advance notice he actually had. What multiple independent sources agree on is simpler. The sale happened, and it happened during a period when Taketsuru's trust in the company's direction was already being tested. Whatever the precise sequence of events, this is the moment several accounts point to as the beginning of the end for the partnership as it had existed for the previous decade.
4 months later, in March 1934, Taketsuru left Kotobukiya. The official reasons were straightforward and undisputed. His 10-year contract, signed back in 1923 when he first joined the company, had run its course, and he'd finished training Torii's own son, Shinjiro's designated successor, in the technical side of the business. Decades later, a Nikkei newspaper retrospective on his career would headline his departure with a single word: amicable. And by most surviving accounts, it genuinely was a professional, orderly handoff, not a public break. But this time, when Taketsuru chose where to build his own distillery, he picked the location he'd wanted from the very beginning, more than 10 years earlier, Yoichi in Hokkaido. There, he founded the company that would eventually become Nikka Whisky, built this time entirely on his own terms. Whether the paperwork tells the whole story, or whether the Tsurumi sale the year before had already made the decision for him in practice, is something the historical record leaves open, and this video is choosing to say so rather than pick a side.
Both companies survived, and both still exist today. Suntory, built on Torii's instinct for what would actually sell to a Japanese customer. Nikka, built on Taketsuru's insistence on doing it the way he'd learned to do it in Scotland, whatever the cost. Today, they're the two dominant names in Japanese whiskey, distilling at sites on opposite ends of the country, sold in bars from Tokyo to New York, and both routinely winning international awards under their own separate names. And both of them trace back to the exact same starting point, the same original partnership, the same first distillery project, and the same decade of disagreements over how fast to move and what counted as good enough to sell. Neither company has ever needed to erase the other from its history to succeed. They simply grew up on opposite ends of the same island and then the same country, running on opposite instincts.
Torii proved that Japan could make whiskey the world would actually want to drink. But the same instincts that got him there, moving fast, deciding alone, betting on commercial timing over craft, were also the instincts that eventually pushed the one person who'd made it all technically possible to go build something of his own. Sometimes, the most successful company and its fiercest rival aren't built by two competitors who never met. They're built by the same two hands, trained by the same decade, just pointed in different directions in the end. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.